And welcome back to The Globe here on SABC News Channel. President Cyril Ramaphosa says the US and South Africa have set up a joint task force on trade and investment to increase business between the two countries. In his letter to the nation today, Ramaphosa reflected on his meeting with US President Joe Biden last week. He says US business leaders are keen to invest in South Africa, explaining that building relationships with other countries is critical to creating opportunities and making the country more competitive. So with regards to stage 6 load shedding sweeping the nation, Ramaphosa says government seized with implementing measures to resolve South Africa's energy situation, which the success of recent planned and launched projects valued at 15.3 billion rands depend. Let's discuss this now with political economist Dr. Dale McKinley, an independent writer and researcher. Very good evening to you, Dr. McKinley. Thank you so much for speaking to us. I was just looking at some of the figures, and I don't know how updated they are. I understand there are about some 600 US businesses in South Africa, and I'd wonder what their view is on the current energy crisis that we're facing, and if others were to ask, should I invest my money in South Africa, what their response would be.
Well, that's a very good question. And I think at the moment, the response would probably be not a particularly positive one. American companies have been in South Africa, obviously, even before 1994 in quite a significant number. But post 1994 have expanded, particularly in auto manufacturing industry. I think one of the largest investors in South Africa in the last 10 years has been the Ford Motor Company in particular. And then you've got in manufacturing, agribusinesses, and obviously minerals and energy as well. So, yeah, I mean, it's a tough, ask right now. I mean, you have our president going over and saying, come and invest. We've got all of these possibilities, but one of the most fundamental needs of any investor, which is energy security, is lacking. So that is a fundamental question that they're going to be asking. And what is the plan and what is going to be done? Part of that task team evidently is going to try to help address this in terms of a just transition from coal-fired to renewable and other sources. But that's a longer term project. And so in the immediate and shorter term, the next 2 to 5 years, it's a serious constraint on any kind of agenda, whether it's President Ramaphosa's or any successive president, to try to convince American companies in particular to invest further.
I mean, the president raising, I think that was in 2018 that we were trying to, or rather the figures say that in 2018 we were trying to raise something like 1.2 trillion rand in new investments over 5 years. So being now in 2002, as you mentioned, the problems that we contend with. So some of the companies that are invested here are in the energy sector. A great deal of the problem of doing business here in South Africa has been the issue of red tape. But I'm just thinking, if we are at a disadvantage right now, then there'd be all kinds of problems, particularly for the ordinary household. If we talk about import tariffs, customs, etc., if we're going to import gadgets or whatever it is to help us get through this.
Yeah, I mean, it cuts both ways. I mean, when you have a poor environment for foreign direct investment in this case, then the quid pro quo in terms of access to other markets and is going to be much more difficult. I mean, parallel to these negotiations, next year they've agreed that South Africa is going to host the forum on AGOA, the American Growth and Opportunity Act. Now, most everybody knows that is crucial, not only to South Africa, but to Southern Africa in terms of access to other markets. And right now, the United States is putting tariffs on steel, aluminium, and other kinds of sort of heavy industry products. But in the context of looking forward, I think what we have is a situation where I would imagine that what your foreign investor is going to say, particularly from the United States, is it's not just about let's come and open a particular factory or let's create a particular industry, but how are we going to be able to invest in a situation in 5 to 10 years where we can be independent of Eskom, where we can have our own power generation, where we can have our own access to, transport, and which is, of course, is another problem. Freight and rail and port transports for exports and imports is right now not in a great state. So I would assume that what there's going to be talking about is not simply just what would normally be the case, which is a basic FDI investment in a particular infrastructural project, but something which is trying to basically wean foreign capital and those who are investing off of an unreliable state. Now, that might sound in some ways quite contradictory, but I think that's probably what the agenda of the United States, in this case, in trade relations, would be in the context of an unreliability of the South African grid, so to speak, the infrastructural grid.
At this joint task force, what kind of conversation would it be having around employment tax incentives, for instance?
Yeah, well, I mean, this has always been, something that has made up trade negotiations. So my understanding is that the Ford Motor Company has made a commitment on the new generation of Ranger, Bakkie, a pickup truck, to basically invest somewhere up to 16 to 20 billion over the next 2 or 3 years. Now, in that case, no doubt there are tax incentives, there are other kinds of incentives. This is standard fare in any FDI agreement. The question, of course, is that what is the return? I mean, this was a debate in the 90s and early 2000s when we had Thabo Mbeki trumpeting a whole range of different foreign investments. And the critique was, these are large-scale investments on paper, but they don't create many jobs and they don't leave much in the economy. So much of it is just shooting outward. So I would assume that if the South Africans are going to get anything out of this other than being basically dictated to by the United States, it would not simply be giving things to people who are coming to invest, but saying, what can we get in return for these things, and negotiating hard in order to be able to, because that's what we need. We don't simply need 10 billion in investment that then disappears and we get maybe a 2 to 3% return. What we need is reinvestment in our economy, job creation, and follow-on products and byproducts, which increasingly would benefit small and medium-scale enterprises. This is what we need. And I'm assuming that, and I would hope that our negotiators and others would be demanding these kinds of things. Otherwise, we're going to be on the losing end of any deals.
And especially on the issue of job creations, that's what a lot of South Africans would really care about at this point. We've been hearing a lot about these special economic zones that are planned for, that are going to be built, and we know that quite a lot of our money from the fiscus goes into infrastructure development. But do they pair up? Do they meet up at some point where we can see real long-term realizable jobs?
Well, one would, we haven't yet. I mean, we have in certain industries. I mean, the automotive industry, to a certain extent, has been quite successful, but it's a very specialized, very highly skilled, generally speaking, creation of particular jobs. So it's not broad-based in that sense. And many of the other investments that we've seen have been very sort of capital-intensive investments, infrastructural investments and others. And we need labor-intensive investments. And this is what's been lacking. We lack at the moment, South Africa generally, our weakest point in any negotiations in this task team that's been set up is that we are not on a really good winning streak at the moment. We are seen as obviously being fairly economically weak. We're not being able to guarantee basics like energy and rail and port infrastructure, at least not to the extent that people would want. And we used to punch way above our weight in trade negotiations and international fora, and I think that we've been brought down to earth in this case. Be that as it may, what we need to have is, we do have a lot of good selling points in the context of a fairly developed economy and a lot of potential. But once again, we get back to the real elephant in the room, so to speak, which is, if we don't have a government and a political class in our country that is willing to tackle these things courageously and head on, and do so fairly quickly, as we've seen with the Eskom crisis, then that goodwill that it still might exist and that willingness to invest is going to evaporate fairly quickly. And with it, all the questions of jobs and the questions of long-term benefits. So we should grasp this nettle fairly quickly. Just like in the domestic scene, I think in the international scene, our star is waning and we need to move fairly quickly.